You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
In 1997, a young boy burned his favorite puppet, Mr. Paws, after claiming it whispered threats in the night. The next morning, the family dog was found dead with its eyes sewn shut, and the puppet was mysteriously back in the boy's bed, untouched by flames. What followed was a terrifying string of deaths, each more brutal than the last, leading one detective to uncover a chilling truth. The puppet wasn't just haunted, it was a prison for something ancient and unspeakable. Now, decades later, Mr. Paws has returned, and this time, it's personal. If you love slow-burn, bone-chilling horror stories with disturbing twists, hit subscribe to Soul Studios. We tell the stories you were never meant to hear, and the next one might be sitting right behind you. I've been a homicide detective for over 30 years, and I thought I had seen it all. I'm retired now, but one disturbing case from 1997 still keeps me up at night. It's a story so strange and chilling that even now, decades later, I question if it really happened. This case involved a little boy, his favorite puppet, and a series of deaths that defied any logical explanation. And by the end of it, I discovered a truth more horrifying than anything I'd encountered before. Back in 1997, I was working in a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where nothing truly bad ever happens. But that summer, something did happen. Something terrible. At first, it seemed like a simple, if bizarre, incident of animal cruelty, but it would unravel into a nightmare that I struggle to recount to this day. If you're squeamish, now might be the time to turn away, because this story only gets darker the deeper we go. It all began on a warm August morning in 1997. I got a call about a disturbance at the Hart family residence. When I arrived at their neatly kept home, I was greeted by a scene of chaos and confusion. The father, Doug Hart, was pacing in the driveway, pale as a sheet. The mother, Janice, was on the front lawn on her knees, crying uncontrollably. Neighbors hovered at the edges of the yard, murmuring in concern. At first glance, I couldn't even tell what had happened, only that this family was obviously traumatized by something. In the backyard, I found out what that something was. Lying in the grass near a little wooden playset was the body of the family dog, a golden retriever named Max. The dog was dead, and the way it had been mutilated made my stomach turn. Max's eyes had been crudely stitched shut with black thread. Thick, dark cord had been laced through the flesh of his eyelids, cinching them together in a grotesque mockery of sleep. I remember crouching down next to the poor animal, heart pounding, trying to process what I was looking at. I'd seen violence before, but this was something different. It was ritualistic, almost personal, as if someone wanted to send a twisted message. I examined the dog carefully, keeping my gloves on and mindful not to contaminate any evidence. There was no blood around the body, which was strange given the nature of the mutilation. It was as if Max had been killed elsewhere and then placed here. The only wound I found, aside from the stitched shut eyes, was a small puncture behind the dog's left ear, almost like an injection site or a precise stab. It was eerily clean. The thread used to sew the eyes was black nylon, the kind you might find in any sewing kit. Whoever did this had a steady hand or an incredibly warped mind. As I stood up, I saw little Caleb Hart, the 7-year-old son of the family, peeking from behind his mother's arm with wide, terrified eyes. He was clutching something tightly to his chest. At that moment, I assumed it was just a toy or a blanket, something to comfort him amid the chaos. I couldn't see it clearly. My attention turned to the parents as I gently began to ask questions, trying to piece together what had happened. Doug told me that early that morning, he had stepped outside to fetch the newspaper when he saw Max lying near the playset. At first he thought the dog was just sleeping, but when Max didn't respond, Doug walked over and discovered the horrifying truth. He had called 911 immediately. Janice, hearing his screams, ran out and then collapsed at the sight of their beloved pet. They insisted they had no idea who could have done such a thing. No enemies, no recent strange visitors. It made no sense. I asked if anything unusual had happened the night before. The couple exchanged a troubled glance. Janice wiped her eyes and mentioned that there had been another incident, not a death, but something that in retrospect seemed very important. The night before, their son Caleb had burned one of his toys in the backyard fire pit. That toy was a puppet named Mr. Paws, Caleb's favorite. This immediately caught my attention. It was an odd detail, a child burning his own toy. I looked down at Caleb, who was still hiding behind his mom. He clutched that object in his arms even more tightly when we mentioned Mr. Paws. I crouched to his level and spoke softly, asking him if I could see what he was holding. After a moment, Caleb hesitantly extended it toward me. In his arms was a small hand puppet about the size of a teddy bear. It looked handmade, a patchwork of soft brown fur with button eyes and little fabric paws. One ear was floppy, the other one half burned at the tip, charred black. I noticed the puppet's face. It had a permanent, stitched-on smile made of yarn. This was Mr. Paws. But how was that possible? The parents had just said Mr. Paws was burned in the fire pit last night. Yet here he was, seemingly intact aside from a bit of charring, back in Caleb's arms. I gently took the puppet from Caleb to examine it. The fur smelled faintly of smoke. The black button eyes stared back at me, giving me an inexplicable chill. One of the button eyes was hanging by a thread, as if partially melted or torn. The body of the puppet had some singe marks, but it was mostly whole. It didn't look like something that had spent long in a fire. "Are you sure this is the same puppet?" I asked Janice. Her face went pale, and she nodded vigorously. They had bought Mr. Paws for Caleb's 7th birthday earlier that year, and it had quickly become his favorite toy. He took it everywhere, talked to it, even slept with it. There was no doubt this was Mr. Paws. The unique stitching and homemade quality were unmistakable. According to the parents, the previous night around 8 p.m, Caleb had been playing in the backyard with Mr. Paws. Suddenly they saw him toss the puppet into the fire pit where the family sometimes burned yard waste. Without warning, Caleb lit the puppet on fire. Janice recalled running out in a panic, pulling Caleb away as Doug doused the flames. The puppet was completely engulfed by then. When they asked Caleb why he did that, he was oddly quiet. According to the parents, the previous night around 8 p.m, Caleb had been playing in the backyard with Mr. Paws. Suddenly, they saw him toss the puppet into the fire pit where the family sometimes burned yard waste. Without warning, Caleb lit the puppet on fire. Janice recalled running out in a panic, pulling Caleb away as Doug doused the flames. The puppet was completely engulfed by then. When they asked Caleb why he did that, he was oddly quiet. Then the boy muttered, "Mr. Paws told me to. He said he wanted to be fire." The parents didn't understand what he meant. They assumed maybe Caleb was acting out some imaginative game or had an episode of some sort. Caleb had never done anything like that before. He adored that puppet. After the fire was out, all that remained of Mr. Paws was a charred lump of melted fur and fabric. Doug had scooped the remains out with a shovel and left them in the fire pit to cool. They took Caleb inside, disciplined him for playing with fire, and put him to bed. They thought that was the end of it, aside from planning to get Caleb in to see a child psychologist perhaps, since the incident was so bizarre. But this morning, just before discovering the dog, Janice went to check on Caleb in his room. She gasped as she described what she saw. Caleb was sound asleep, and Mr. Paws was tucked in bed with him, as perfect as ever, not burned at all. Janice actually went out to the fire pit to confirm she hadn't dreamed the burning the night before. Sure enough, the pile of blackened fabric and plastic buttons was still there in the pit. In disbelief and growing fear, Janice hurried back inside and found Caleb awake, silently playing with Mr. Paws on the floor of his room as if nothing had happened. She and Doug were unnerved by this, but they didn't have long to process it because minutes later, Doug stepped outside and found Max dead. So to recap, A beloved puppet is burned to ashes, yet somehow back in the child's room by morning, fully intact. Then the family dog is brutally killed and mutilated in the backyard, with its eyes sewn shut. On the surface, these events didn't seem connected. One was just a strange incident with a toy, the other a heinous act of animal cruelty. But occurring on the same night at the same house, it was hard to believe it was just coincidence. I remember standing there in the Hart's yard, puppet in hand, feeling a deep unease creep over me. I had a burnt toy that shouldn't exist, a dead pet with a disturbingly surgical mutilation, and a boy who calmly said a puppet told him to set it on fire. None of it made any sense. Initially, as a detective, I approached the case rationally. The most straightforward explanation for Max's death was that some disturbed individual had snuck into the yard overnight, killed the dog, and for some unfathomable reason sewed its eyes shut. Perhaps the same person even returned the puppet to Caleb's room as a cruel prank, though I couldn't imagine how or why. Maybe the perpetrator was trying to scare the family or had a grudge against them. We began treating it as a potential breaking and entering with animal cruelty. I alerted our crime scene unit to sweep the yard and house for any evidence of an intruder. Footprints, fingerprints, fibers, anything. While waiting for the CSU team, I continued talking to the Harts. We moved the conversation inside to the living room, away from the distressing sight in the yard. Caleb sat close to his mom on the couch, Mr. Paws still clutched in his small hands. I noticed he never let that puppet out of his grip for long. Doug was trembling, anger and fear warring in his expression. He kept saying he was going to find whatever sicko did this and make them pay. I assured him we'd do everything we could to find the culprit. But truthfully, we had very little to go on at that moment. I asked if they had security cameras. They didn't. Home security cameras weren't common in 1997, especially not in our safe neighborhood. No one heard or saw anything in the night. The yards in this area were unfenced and backed up to a patch of woods, so theoretically someone could have crept in quietly. But who would do this? The Harts were well liked in the community. Doug was a local electrician. Janice volunteered at the library. No known enemies or disgruntled clients. Then there was Caleb's behavior. I gently asked him again about the previous night. He was shy, fidgeting with Mr. Paws' little paws, clearly scared. In a soft voice, he told me he didn't want to burn Mr. Paws, but Mr. Paws was angry and needed to get hurt. These words sent a chill down my spine. It sounded almost as if Caleb believed the puppet was alive, with feelings and anger. I exchanged a concerned glance with Janice. She explained that after the dog was found, Caleb had said something strange to her. He said Mr. Paws didn't. He claimed the puppet had killed Max for revenge because they tried to burn him. Hearing this, Doug had gotten upset and told Caleb to stop talking nonsense. They feared their son was having some kind of breakdown or perhaps trying to deflect blame if he had somehow hurt the dog. At that point, I was honestly considering whether Caleb himself might have done something to the dog. It's a horrible thought, but investigators must consider all possibilities. Could a traumatized 7-year-old have killed his own pet in the middle of the night? It seemed far-fetched. Caleb was by all accounts a sweet kid, and the method, sewing the eyes, seemed too sophisticated for a child. But I couldn't ignore that the boy was present for both unusual events, and he was coming up with a living puppet explanation which, frankly, sounded like a cover story from a child's imagination. However, the puppet reappearing unharmed was the sticking point. If Caleb had killed the dog, who or what brought the burned puppet back? The only other people in the house were the parents, and they seemed genuinely shocked and terrified by that. If it was a prank or hoax, it was an elaborate, cruel one targeting their own kid and pet. Soon, the crime scene unit arrived and began their work. They took the dog's body for a necropsy, animal autopsy, and collected the thread from its eyes for analysis. I had them collect the charred remains from the fire pit as well, the remnants of the first burning of Mr. Paws. I also decided to take the puppet that was in Caleb's possession as evidence, at least for the day. Caleb protested loudly when I gently pulled Mr. Paws away from him and placed the puppet in a plastic evidence bag. The boy burst into tears, which made me feel like the worst villain in the world. But I needed to examine that puppet in detail, maybe send it to the lab too. If nothing else, I wanted to see if the threads from the dog's eyes matched any material from the puppet, or if there were any strange residues on it. Janice had to console Caleb by promising that I would bring Mr. Paws back soon. I remember Caleb looked directly at me, tears in his eyes, and said very gravely, "Be careful. Mr. Paws doesn't like grown-ups." The way he said it gave me a shiver. With the evidence collected and the family given instructions to stay safe and alert, I left the Hart's house around midday to head back to the station. I dropped off the evidence, the puppet and the charred remnants, plus the thread, at our forensics lab for testing, though I knew results would take time. I grabbed a quick lunch at my desk, but my mind was entirely on the case. Something about that puppet unnerved me, even as it sat sealed in a bag across the room. I found myself glancing at it repeatedly, almost expecting it to move. Of course it didn't. Not that I saw. That afternoon, I got a preliminary report from the veterinary pathologist who examined Max, our dog victim. The cause of death was surprising. Max had died from heart failure induced by extreme fear. Essentially, the poor dog was literally scared to death. There were high levels of stress hormones in his blood. There were microscopic tears in cardiac tissue consistent with a massive adrenaline surge. The small puncture wound behind the ear had no poison or drug traces. It might not have even been the cause of death at all. In fact, they suspected the needle poke, if it was a needle, happened after the dog was dead, possibly to draw blood or inject something post-mortem. That made no sense either. Why would someone kill a dog through fright and then poke it with a needle? The thread used on the eyes was ordinary polyester thread, nothing unique except for the way it was used. This information only deepened the mystery. If a person did this, how could they scare a dog to death? Could they have literally frightened it somehow? One colleague suggested maybe the dog was chased and had a heart attack from stress. Certain breeds are prone to that. But Max was a young, healthy retriever. And then there's the grotesque stitching, which had to be done by a human, or at least by something with dexterity. No matter which angle I turned it, I kept circling back to that puppet. Caleb's words, "Mr. Paws did it," kept replaying in my mind. I decided to hold off on jumping to any supernatural conclusions. That's not what detectives do. Instead, I refocused on investigation basics. Perhaps someone was using the puppet as a prop or a calling card. Maybe a disturbed neighbor kid or cult in the area. Yes, it crossed my mind that the staged nature of the dog's death had a cultish vibe. I made a few calls to nearby precincts to ask if they'd had similar cases, or any reports of animal mutilations, break-ins, or weird symbols left behind. The answer was no, nothing remotely like this. Ours was the only incident of its kind. By early evening, I decided to call it a day and headed home with a plan to return to the Harts the next morning for a follow-up. Before leaving the station, I checked in on the evidence locker where I'd had the puppet stored, sealed in its bag. I'll admit, a part of me wanted to make sure it was still there, that it hadn't walked out on its own. It was there, motionless, just a lifeless toy in a bag on a shelf. I shook my head at my own fanciful worries and headed out. I could never have guessed what the night was about to bring. Shortly after 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a phone call from dispatch. Another incident at the Hart residence. This time, Caleb's father, Doug, was dead. I drove through the empty streets, adrenaline surging, dread forming a knot in my stomach. 2 deaths in 24 hours at the same household. We were way beyond coincidence. I remember gripping the steering wheel tightly, my mind racing through possibilities. Could the perpetrator have returned? Was the family targeted by someone with a vendetta? Or was it something else entirely, something I was afraid to name? When I arrived, the house was lit up with red and blue lights. Several patrol cars and an ambulance were already there. Neighbors, roused from sleep, stood in clutches on their porches or lawns, watching the commotion with horrified expressions. I pushed my way under the police tape and inside the house. The scene I walked into is one I will never forget. Doug Hart's body was sitting upright in his armchair in the living room, as if he'd just nodded off while watching late-night TV. except the TV was off and Doug's blank eyes were open. Or rather, they would have been open if they hadn't been sewn shut just like the dog's. Thick black thread crisscrossed his eyelids. My fellow officers at the scene looked as disturbed as I felt. One of them, a young rookie, rushed out the front door as I arrived. I later learned it was because he got sick at the sight. I approached Doug carefully. Unlike the dog, there was blood here, a dark dried patch of it on the front of Doug's shirt. I saw a wound at his abdomen, a quick clean slice as if from a scalpel or sharp knife. The positioning was strange, a single precise stab just below his ribcage. It reminded me of surgical incisions. His hands were placed neatly on his lap, and there, sitting on the floor by his feet, was Mr. Paws. I felt a chill so deep I can still feel it today. How was the puppet here? I left it locked up at the station evidence room, yet there it was, out of the bag, looking up at us with that frozen smile. One button eye dangled loosely now, giving it a deranged appearance. It was as if the puppet was proudly watching the chaos it caused. Of course, at that moment I still tried to be rational. Perhaps I had been careless and someone stole the puppet from the locker, though there was no sign of forced entry at the station. Or perhaps, and I hated to even think it, Caleb had somehow gotten it back. But how would a 7-year-old sneak into a police station? No, none of that made sense. I forced myself to focus. The priority was checking on the survivors. Janice and Caleb were thankfully unharmed physically, but both were in a state of shock. Paramedics were gently treating Janice for hysteria. She was sobbing and kept repeating, "I saw it. I saw it." I sat down with Caleb, who was wrapped in a blanket, shaking uncontrollably. The look on that poor kid's face, it was like he had seen a monster. I asked him what happened. At first he was too stunned to speak, but eventually, haltingly, he told me, Mr. Paws came back. According to Caleb, everyone had gone to bed around 10 p.m. His dad, Doug, fell asleep in the armchair in the living room, as he often did after a long day. Janice was in the bedroom down the hall. Caleb said he woke up when he heard Mr. Paws's voice. Hearing this, a veteran officer giving the statement beside me raised an eyebrow and glanced at me, but I urged Caleb to continue. The boy claimed the puppet's voice sounded like a whispery little cartoon character. It was coming from the living room, calling his name. Caleb, Caleb, over and over. Caleb got out of bed and peered down the dark hallway. In the faint glow of a nightlight, he could see Mr. Paws standing in the hallway, on its own, beckoning him with one arm. My skin crawled as I listened. Caleb said he was scared, but the puppet spoke nicely, saying it just wanted to play. It turned and walked away, disappearing into the living room. A moment later, Caleb heard his father let out a short, strangled cry. That's when Janice woke up, and presumably when the attack happened. Janice ran out of the bedroom, and Caleb crept behind her, clutching his blanket. They both saw something in the living room in the darkness. Janice would later struggle to describe it to me. She said it was small, maybe the height of a toddler, and it moved fast. She saw her husband jerking in his chair as this small, shadowy figure clung to him. Janice screamed and fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with light, and the figure was gone. But Doug was left lifeless, his eyes threaded shut and a stain of blood spreading on his shirt. Mr. Paws lay at his feet. Janice's scream is what prompted a neighbor to call the police. Caleb said nothing after that. He only remembered the puppet looking at him as he stood in the hallway, as if warning him to stay quiet. Whether or not you believe a 7-year-old's account of a walking, talking puppet, the physical evidence certainly matched the boy's story in one sense. This death looked like the work of the same person or thing that killed the dog. The black thread, the precise cut, it was too similar. We had a serial offender, and now it had escalated from animal to human. I had so many questions and no solid answers. We scoured the house and surrounding area for signs of an intruder. The windows were locked, no doors had been opened, no footprints or ladders, nothing. It's as if the killer literally appeared inside and vanished into thin air. The only odd clue was a faint, sooty residue on the living room carpet, leading from the armchair to the hallway. almost like ash or charcoal dust in small shoe prints. I bent down to look closer. They were the size of a child's footprints, or a small doll's. The prints stopped halfway down the hall, not far from Caleb's bedroom door, then just disappeared. My fellow officers were scratching their heads. Some of them started muttering about the occult or paranormal, unable to find a better explanation. The evidence locker at the station was checked. It was still locked and undisturbed, but the puppet was gone from inside. This chilled everyone who knew. There was no rational way for that puppet to be here at the crime scene after being locked up, yet here it was. I collected Mr. Paws again, carefully in a bag. I noticed something new as I handled it. Its formerly soft paws felt wet. When I pulled my latex glove off, I saw a reddish smear. It was blood. Tiny handprints in blood on the puppet's fur. The prints were too small to be an adult's, too oddly shaped to be a child's. It was as if the puppet itself had blood on its little paws from what it had done. I admit my hands trembled a bit placing it in the evidence bag this time. We had to take Janice and Caleb to the station for their safety and to take formal statements. The rest of the night was a blur of police procedure mixed with a dawning, unspeakable fear. I remember stepping outside the house at one point, around 4 a.m., needing air. The sky was just beginning to lighten with early dawn. In my career, I had been a grounded, fact-based guy, but at that moment, standing in the dewy grass of the Hart's front yard, I was confronted with the very real possibility that something supernatural was happening. It was a possibility I did not want to accept, but how else could I reconcile the facts? Over the next day, the case of the killer puppet, as my more snarky colleagues began to call it, consumed my every waking thought. Janice and Caleb stayed at a relative's house for safety, under watch by a patrol car. I promised Janice I would get to the bottom of this, though I could see the despair in her eyes. She'd just lost her husband and her dog in horrific ways within 24 hours. The poor woman was barely hanging on, and little Caleb had withdrawn completely, speaking only to say he wanted Mr. Paws back. We obviously weren't going to give him that puppet, but we had child psychologists talk to him. They concluded Caleb truly believed the puppet was alive and responsible. He showed signs of extreme trauma, not deceit. Meanwhile, I dove into researching everything about that puppet. I started with how the Harts acquired it. Janice had mentioned they bought Mr. Paws at a thrift store, so that morning I drove out to the Dusty Attic, a second-hand shop on the edge of town. The place was quiet, dimly lit, with aisles of forgotten treasures and junk. The bell jingled as I walked in. I explained to the elderly owner who I was and what I was investigating. The mention of the Hart family immediately made the old woman's face fall. The news of Doug's death and the bizarre circumstances had already spread through town. When I showed her a photo of Mr. Paws taken from the evidence file, her eyes widened with recognition. She told me she did remember that puppet. It had been donated with a box of old toys about a year earlier. The box came from an estate sale. A man named Leonard Porter had passed away, and his belongings were donated by a distant relative who was handling the estate. Among them was the puppet. The shop owner said she remembered Mr. Paws, though it wasn't called that then, because when she first picked it up, she pricked her finger on something sharp hidden in its plush body. She almost threw it out, thinking it was defective or dangerous. But after feeling around, she couldn't find the sharp bit again. Assuming it was her imagination, she placed the puppet on a shelf. In the weeks that followed, no one showed any interest in it until Janice Hart came in looking for a present for her son's birthday. Caleb immediately took to the little puppet, and Janice bought it for a few dollars. I thanked the owner and asked for the address of Leonard Porter's estate. This was my next lead. If this puppet had a history, maybe Leonard knew something about it. I tracked down Leonard's obituary and some old records. He had been a widower, no children, known to be a bit of an eccentric. Neighbors described him as quiet but odd. Some mentioned he traveled a lot in his youth. I managed to contact the relative who had handled the estate, a niece named Sharon. Over the phone, Sharon told me she barely knew Leonard, but among his belongings, there were a lot of strange books and artifacts. He had an interest in the occult. she said, always talking about spirits and ancient rituals. She found it creepy and admitted she quickly donated most of his stuff to be rid of it. One thing Sharon recalled distinctly: Leonard had a collection of dolls and puppets from around the world. Many of them were quite old. She didn't remember a specific puppet like Mr. Paws, but said it was possible it was part of his collection. Unfortunately, she'd thrown away most of the collection or given it away piecemeal. The idea that Mr. Paws might be a decades-old artifact from a man who dabbled in the occult made my detective instincts hum. Perhaps Leonard Porter had somehow cursed this puppet, or trapped something inside it. It sounded crazy, but increasingly less crazy than the rational explanations. I got permission to search Leonard's old house, which was still vacant, awaiting sale. There, amid dust-covered furniture, I found Leonard's library. Books on demonology, pagan religions, and something that caught my eye: ventriloquism and spirit communication. One book, lying on the floor, open as if dropped, had a chapter on using dolls as vessels for spirits. I read with a mix of fascination and dread. The concept was that a spirit, sometimes an ancient entity or demon, could be bound to an inanimate figure, like a doll or puppet, through a ritual. The vessel would imprison the entity, at least until certain conditions were met or rituals performed to either appease or expel it. There were notes scribbled in the margins, likely by Leonard. Phrases like "the eyes are the window," "must blind it to bind it," and "do not feed with fear" were jotted in pencil. This seemed relevant. Eyes, binding, fear. My heart rate quickened. Was it possible Leonard had bound something inside Mr. Paws? Maybe an entity that was now loose because the puppet was burned? I thought back to Caleb's actions. He said Mr. Paws told him it wanted to be fire. Maybe the entity wanted the puppet destroyed to be free? If the puppet was a prison, burning it might have momentarily freed the being, or weakened the bindings. And then it killed the dog, perhaps as revenge or just malice, and then reformed the puppet, or teleported it back to the boy. The eyes sewn shut. That detail from Leonard's notes: "The eyes are the window, must blind it to bind it." Could it be that the entity, when it kills, sews the eyes of its victims shut to blind their souls, or to symbolically blind itself? I wasn't sure, but the parallel was striking. Digging through more of Leonard's things, I found a small leather-bound journal. Many pages were water-damaged or illegible, but one entry sent a jolt through me. March 3rd, 1971. The entity grew restless last night. I awoke to find Miska, my cat, dead on the doorstep, eyes sewn shut with black thread. The binding ritual holds, but it is angry. I must be more careful. I fear it wants me next. The doll is the key. I hear it whisper in the twilight. Miska the cat. Sewn eyes. This was exactly the pattern in the Hart household, but decades earlier. Leonard clearly dealt with the same entity. He mentioned a binding ritual and that the doll is the key. If Mr. Paws was that doll, or one of them, Leonard somehow trapped this malevolent thing in the puppet. It killed his cat, probably others. I scanned further. June 18th, 1971. I have contained it for now. The doll, the one with paws, holds the spirit. I stitched the doll's eyes closed to subdue it, to blind the demon inside. Now it sleeps, I think. I will not remove the stitches, not after what happened to poor Miska. I dare not destroy it outright. Fire only made it manifest and lash out. As long as the puppet remains, perhaps I can keep it imprisoned. I will continue the prayers nightly. My hands were trembling by this point. The one with paws. A puppet with paws that had to be Mr. Paws. Leonard had stitched its eyes closed. But when the Harts had it, the puppet's eyes were buttons, not sewn shut. Maybe at some point after Leonard died, someone restored the puppet's eyes. Perhaps the thrift store owner, or Sharon thought the missing eyes were just damage and fixed it with new buttons, unknowingly undoing Leonard's binding. Or maybe the entity itself regained strength and pushed the buttons out. The charred remains in the fire pit did include a melted black button. It was all coming together in a horrifying way. An ancient, malevolent entity was bound inside this puppet. Leonard Porter managed to contain it for decades, but upon his death, the puppet ended up in circulation. At some point, the binding, the eyes being sewn, was reversed, giving the entity more freedom. When Caleb burned the puppet, that likely further weakened the prison, allowing the entity to act directly and viciously. Leonard's final entry in that legible section read, October 31st, 1972. I fear I am near the end of my rope. The entity is too strong to contain. If anyone finds this, you must keep its eyes closed. Do not trust the puppet's silence. Bury it in hallowed ground if you can. I've done what I can to appease it, but I think it knows my heart is weak. May God forgive me for bringing this into our realm. It didn't say how Leonard brought this into our realm, perhaps through some ritual or a trip abroad where he acquired it, but he knew how to bind it, sewing eyes shut, and to bury it in holy ground. Clearly, he didn't succeed in truly destroying it. He died in 1996 of a stroke in his sleep, according to records. Maybe the demon killed him when he was vulnerable, or maybe old age got him. Either way, the puppet was free after his death, eyes open, buttons. And a year later the Hearts bought it. A child's innocent love might have sustained or awoken it further. Caleb spoke to it, treated it as real. Maybe that attention nourished the thing. Armed with this knowledge, I realized that conventional police work was not going to solve this. We were dealing with something supernatural and deadly. I couldn't exactly put out an APB on a demon-possessed puppet. Instead, I took Leonard's journal and headed back to the station. I kept this information mostly to myself. I knew how it sounded. I did, however, confide in one colleague, an older sergeant who had an interest in the paranormal. He didn't laugh or call me crazy. In fact, he believed me. The evidence was hard to refute. We quietly made a plan to neutralize Mr. Paws once and for all, using the clues from Leonard's notes. Our plan was risky and unorthodox, to say the least. We decided to lure the puppet, or rather the entity controlling it, into a trap. According to Leonard's notes, the entity was enraged by attempts to destroy or bind it, but also drawn out by them. We guessed that if we tried another burning or some kind of ritual in a controlled setting, we might force it to show itself, then contain or destroy it properly. We also agreed that keeping the eyes of the puppet closed was key to subduing it. Leonard had done it by stitching them, but the buttons were currently attached, one loosely. We had no time to lose. That very night, we feared the puppet would strike again, perhaps targeting Caleb or Janice next. I retrieved Mr. Paws from evidence once more, this time with permission to transfer it. Basically, I signed it out to myself. We brought Janice and Caleb back to their home in the evening, against standard protocol as bait. I hated involving them, but Janice bravely agreed when I told her it might be the only way to end this for good. We assured her we'd be right there and wouldn't let anything happen to them. Our plan was to have Janice and Caleb in the house as usual at night, while I and two officers, including the sergeant, stayed hidden nearby with what amounted to paranormal combat gear. We had brought a church pastor's holy water, a crucifix, some salt. Old folk remedies die hard, and crucially, a heavy-duty sewing kit with a large needle and black thread. I was going to attempt to sew the puppet's eyes shut again if I got the chance, hoping to weaken it. Additionally, we prepared the backyard fire pit for a second burning, this time with the fire already roaring and doused in a mix of gasoline and blessed oils. If we got hold of the puppet, we'd douse it and burn it while its eyes were sewn, assuming that would trap the thing in its death throes. It felt absurd, like we were gearing up to hunt a ghost in a horror movie, but this was the path the case had taken. Night fell. The house was dark and silent. Janice tucked Caleb in as usual, though neither could sleep. We stationed ourselves out of sight, one officer in a patrol car down the street watching the front, and me and the sergeant hidden in the backyard shed where we had a view of the back door and the yard. The plan was loose. If the puppet showed up, we'd intervene. We half expected it to target the house again. We waited in tense silence for hours, the only sound the distant chirping of crickets and our own breathing. Midnight came and went. Nothing. I was starting to worry that maybe the entity sensed the trap or had chosen a different time or place to strike. It was around 3:15 a.m., that eerie time of night, when things finally happened. We heard a soft creaking noise from inside the house. Through a gap in the shed's boards, I saw the back door of the house slowly swing open. My heart leapt into my throat. A small, shadowy figure stood in the doorway, about 3 feet tall, shaped like a child but all wrong. It moved with a jerky but quick gait as it stepped out onto the back patio. The motion sensor light did not come on, as if it wasn't triggering, perhaps because of the entity's nature. But in the faint moonlight, I could make it out. Mr. Paws, walking on its own, dragging something along the ground behind it. I realized with horror that it was dragging Caleb by the hand. The boy was sleepwalking, or in a trance, following the puppet without resistance. I signaled to my partner and we silently slipped out of the shed, flanking around. I had my firearm drawn, though I had no clue if bullets could even slow this thing down. The puppet led the boy towards the fire pit. There was already a low fire burning there. We had kept it smouldering just in case. In its high-pitched whisper of a voice, barely audible, I could hear it speaking to Caleb. Almost time to play. Caleb, come on, let's play by the fire. The blood in my veins turned to ice. This thing intended to throw Caleb into the flames, or something far worse. Before it could do anything, I stepped out into the open and shouted, "Stop right there." My flashlight beam hit the puppet and the boy. Caleb was barefoot in his pajamas, eyes open but unseeing, clearly under the entity's control. Mr. Paws slowly turned its head towards me. Seeing that adorable patched face in motion, contorting into what I can only describe as a look of pure hatred, was utterly chilling. Its little mouth didn't move, but I heard a raspy giggle echo around the yard. He's mine now. The voice didn't come exactly from the puppet. It was like it emanated from the air around us, childlike and demonic at once. The sergeant moved to the side, trying to get behind the puppet. In a flash, Mr. Paws released Caleb's hand and lunged at me with inhuman speed. I mean, it covered a 20-foot distance in the blink of an eye. I saw a glint of metal. The puppet had a shard of glass or a knife in its paw, and it swiped at my face. I stumbled back. Later I realized it cut my cheek, but adrenaline kept me from feeling it. I swung my flashlight like a club, smashing it against the puppet, knocking it to the ground. It felt like hitting a small sack of potatoes. The puppet rolled and was on its feet again, unnaturally. The sergeant by now had grabbed Caleb and was dragging the dazed boy away from the pit towards the house, while shouting a prayer under his breath. I advanced on Mr. Paws, and it cocked its fabric head at me. In the firelight, I could see its button eyes glinting, one dangling loosely, the other firmly attached. Those eyes, windows for the entity, perhaps. It crouched as if to spring again. I didn't give it the chance. I'm not proud of what happened next, but instinct took over. I kicked the puppet like a football, sending it sailing a good 10 yards. As it flew, I heard a shriek, not from the puppet's form exactly, but the air around it, that same disembodied, shrill cry. The puppet landed near the fire pit, sprawled on the ground. Seizing the moment, I rushed forward with the prepared needle and thread. I had it wound around my left hand ready. Mr. Paws twitched and started to get up, but I slammed my knee onto its back, pinning the little monster down. It writhed unnaturally strong. The strength belied its size and stuffing. My partner shouted warnings as he saw the thing's arm twisting backward toward me, clutching that glass shard. I felt a sharp pain as it stabbed into my leg, but I gritted my teeth and focused. I forced the puppet's head down and drove the needle through its right button eye, threading it through the fabric and out the other side of its head. I yanked hard, pulling the thread taut across its face, effectively sewing one of its eyes in place and covering part of the other eye. The puppet let out a blood-curdling screech that sounded like a child being tortured, causing both me and the sergeant to flinch. Black, tar-like liquid gushed from the puppet's mouth, splattering my hands. It burned like acid. I yelled in pain, but kept threading, looping the cord again to firmly bind across the eyes. Keep them closed. I remembered Leonard's words. I made one final stitch, the needle snapping from the force through thick fabric. The moment the last stitch was done, the puppet's convulsions stopped abruptly. It went limp, collapsing in a heap as if suddenly devoid of life. The night went eerily quiet, save for the crackling of the fire and our own heavy breathing. Did we do it? I looked down at the once adorable toy now oozing black sludge onto the grass. Its eyes were now obscured by the black thread crisscrossing its face. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the ground beneath us trembled slightly, and a shrill scream erupted from the puppet, or from inside it. The sound was inhuman, a wail of pure rage and pain. I knew we had only angered the entity further, but hopefully also weakened it or pinned it down. "Now!" I shouted. The sergeant who had handed Caleb off to the other officer was ready with the gasoline. He rushed over and doused the puppet and the area around it. I grabbed a long fireplace poker, hooked it under the puppet, and with all my might flung the writhing, screaming bundle into the heart of the fire pit. Flames shot up as the gasoline ignited. We both stumbled back from the heat. Inside the fire, I could make out the silhouette of Mr. Paws sitting upright amidst the flames. The black sludge sizzled and popped. A horrific stench filled the air, like burning hair and sulfur. That tiny figure began to thrash and twist, but I noticed it never managed to stand up and run out of the fire. The stitching held. Maybe it kept the entity bound to the puppet long enough to burn it. The screams rose in pitch, sounding more and more like a terrified child's shrieks, mixed with an animal's roar. It was an unbearable sound that echoed into the night. I wanted to cover my ears, but I held my ground, watching to be sure it was destroyed. As the flames engulfed the puppet, I swear I saw shapes in the fire. A snarling face, horns, eyes that blinked in and out. It could have been my imagination, or the fire playing tricks, but it was as if something was twisting in agony, being consumed. Finally, after what felt like ages, but was likely only a minute or two, the screams faded into a low hiss. The fire settled, burning more normally now. The puppet's form was collapsing into ash and char. I stepped closer carefully. Among the blackened mass, I could still see a bit of that brown fur and the glint of metal. The needle I had used now partially melted into the thing. We stayed until the fire had nearly died out on its own. Just to be thorough, we shoveled the remains and spread them out, dousing everything with holy water and salt. Perhaps overkill, but we weren't taking chances. Caleb, now fully awake and crying for his mother, was safe. Janice, who had run outside after hearing the commotion and screams, embraced her boy tightly, both of them sobbing in relief. We all stood there, smoke rising into the pre-dawn sky, as an enormous weight seemed to lift from that place. It was over, or so we thought. In the official police report, of course, we couldn't write, "burned a demon-possessed puppet to save child." We ended up attributing the murders of Doug and the dog to a crazed intruder who then set fire to himself in the backyard in some kind of suicide, hence the remains of an unknown individual. We let the remains be collected and misidentified as human ash to close the case. It was a stretch, but no one in the neighborhood or department wanted to contest it. Those who were there that night knew the truth, but we agreed to keep it quiet. Who would believe us, anyway? And more importantly, we didn't want any more attention drawn to this cursed object, in case it somehow wasn't fully destroyed. Janice and Caleb moved away not long after, understandably. They went to live with Janice's sister across the country to start fresh. I kept in touch with them for a while. Caleb slowly recovered from the trauma, though he would never again have a puppet or even a stuffed animal. Too many bad memories. I hear he grew up to be a fine young man despite it all. As for me, the case of Mr. Paws was the beginning of the end of my police career. I didn't last many more years on the force. I found myself unable to continue pretending that all evil has a logical explanation. Sometimes evil is just evil, unseen, ancient, hungry. For a long time, I believed we had truly defeated the entity that lurked in Mr. Paws. I even slept soundly most nights, thinking the nightmare was finally over. I kept Leonard Porter's journal and the case files locked away, a reminder of how strange and dark the world can be. In my retirement, I moved on with life as best I could, trying to convince myself that it was an isolated incident, one anomalous brush with the supernatural. But evil like that doesn't sleep forever, and sometimes the past comes knocking when you least expect it. Here's where things take a final turn that I never saw coming. A few days ago, nearly 28 years since that summer of 1997, I received a call from my grown daughter, Denise. She was excited, chatting about how she'd found the perfect birthday gift for my 5-year-old grandson at a local flea market. As I half listened, she explained that it was an old puppet she found in a dusty trunk of toys. "It's this cute little handmade puppet, Dad," I remember her saying. It's a brown animal puppet with button eyes and little fabric paws. Tommy already loves it. He's been calling it Mr. Paws all afternoon. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hand clenched so hard around the phone that my knuckles went white. Did you say Mr. Paws? I stammered, trying to keep my voice calm. My daughter laughed lightly, not sensing my dread. Yeah, that's what Tommy named him. Silly, huh? He says the puppet told him its name. At that, I nearly dropped the phone. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear her. I asked her, probably sounding crazed, to send me a picture immediately. Slightly concerned by my tone, she agreed. What arrived moments later made my entire world tilt. It was a photo of my sweet grandson holding up a puppet for the camera. The image was a bit blurry, but I could see it clear as day. Brown fur, one ear floppy, black button eyes, and a stitched-on yarn smile. It was Mr. Paws. Somehow, impossibly, Mr. Paws was back. The very puppet I burned and watched turn to ash, apparently not destroyed after all, or perhaps reborn. The thought made me sick. In the photo, one of the puppet's button eyes hung loosely by a thread, just as I remembered from that night. Did my daughter not find that detail disturbing? Or had it only just come loose? I didn't know, and it didn't matter. I knew exactly what we were dealing with. In a panic, I called Denise and told her in the sternest possible terms, "Take that puppet away from Tommy and don't let him play with it. Lock it somewhere safe and I'll explain when I get there." Sensing the urgency in my voice, she agreed, though I could tell she was utterly bewildered. She said Tommy was upset and crying because she took the puppet away suddenly. He kept saying, "Grandpa, please don't let Mr. Paws burn me. He's sorry. He just wants to play." Hearing those words coming out of my little grandson's mouth nearly stopped my heart. The cycle was beginning again. The whispers, the manipulation. That ancient evil had found a new child, a new family to torment. My family. I'm recording this narration as I sit on a plane racing across the country to reach them. I have in my carry-on bag Leonard's old journal, a flask of holy water, a sturdy sewing kit, and yes, my handgun. My retired badge still has its privileges for carrying it. I feel like a soldier heading to war, yet I'm an old man now, not the sharp detective I once was. The dread and gravity of facing Mr. Paws again after all these years is almost overwhelming. But I have one advantage I didn't back then. I know what I'm dealing with. I know how to bind it, even if I failed to end it permanently last time. This time, I intend to finish the job once and for all, or die trying. As the plane prepares to land, I whisper a prayer that I'm not too late. The image of that puppet in my grandson's hands is burned into my mind. I can only imagine what horrors might already be unfolding. If you're hearing this story, it means I've decided the world needs to know about the strange, dark events that happened and continue to happen. Some evil refuses to die. It might slumber for years, but it always creeps back. Mr. Paws is out there again, and the thought of what it could do to the people I love is the worst nightmare of all. I glance down now at my phone and see a new text from my daughter. Just one word: hurry. Attached is a photo. It shows a small, shadowy figure standing at the foot of my grandson's bed, illuminated by the dim nightlight. My daughter and grandson are nowhere in frame, hopefully safe in another room as I instructed. But that figure, even in the grainy image, I know it's him. That damned puppet. Mr. Paws is waiting. This time I will face it with no hesitation. The story hasn't ended yet, but one way or another it will end soon. I close my eyes and steel myself for what's to come, haunted by a truth I can no longer escape. In this strange, dark world we live in, sometimes the most innocent faces hide the most ancient evils, and sometimes the monsters of our past find their way home. The case of Mr. Paws will reach its final chapter tonight, and I pray that I'm writing the ending. The camera cuts on the final image of a tattered puppet silhouette in a dark hallway, the faint sound of a child's giggle turning into a rasping hiss. The screen fades to black. So, what do you think? Was Mr. Paws just an old puppet, or something far older that refuses to stay buried? And if you ever find a toy staring at you in the dark, you better hope it doesn't blink first. Some toys are made for children, others are made for revenge.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week, so if you crave suspense, the unexplained, and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.